The wait is finally over. 18 years after the release of the first Percy Jackson book, we finally have a screen adaptation that at least promised to be loyal to the original material, and that even had the book's author, Rick Riordan, heavily involved in the creative process. But as this first season comes to an end, it's time to judge if this was really a good and faithful adaptation. My name is Inês, and as a kid, I read all the books in the Percy Jackson series, plus all the books in the Heroes of Olympus series and all of the little extra books. So, as you can expect, I was pretty hyped for this show, and I also saw that it would be fun, and so I reread the entire first book while watching the episodes so that I wouldn't let anything pass me by. And I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected, even as an adult. So in this video, I will not only talk about the Disney Plus series, but also how the book holds up almost 20 years later, and you can expect spoilers for both the book and the series. Over the last few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about what I think and how I feel about this adaptation, and the conclusion that I got was that I have pretty mixed feelings about this show. Some things are great, and they really nailed it when making certain scenes come to life. In some instances for me, the show even improves on the book's material. But for the most part, my opinion and my expectations for the series went down as the episodes aired. And in planning this video, I really tried to make sense of all the reasons that make the show not work as well, and how they can improve them in the next season. As far as I'm concerned, a lot of the problems with the show can be associated with its runtime, the gigantic amount of exposition it depends on, the pacing of the show and the completely pointless changes, also how they depict the gods, and finally, and here I never thought that I would consider this a bad thing, but how this was a show made for fans. Let's start with why the expectations were higher this time around, since this isn't the first time that Percy Jackson has been adapted, and there is even a Percy Jackson musical. In case you didn't know, in 2010 the series was adapted into the big screen, but they ended up changing the plot and aged the characters a great deal, and so is considered by many, myself included, one of the worst adaptations ever. At that time, Rick Riordan expressed his concerns about the script to the studio, but his feedback was basically ignored, and since then he has always been very critical of the movies. So I was very happy when he announced that there would be a Disney Plus series adaptation of the books, but this time he would be much more involved in the project, and that's every fan's dream. As far as I can tell, he really is the front face of the show. He's very much involved in the creative process, including writing the scripts, even though if you go and check, he didn't write most of them, and he even has done a bunch of interviews promoting the show. So initially, because of all of this, I reread the first book so that I could be totally ready for this to be a very faithful adaptation. I know, wishful thinking, and for me to be like, in this scene that line is wrong, or they cut that moment, and things like that. But in reality, very quickly going to the first 2 episodes, it became clear that this is an adaptation, and a lot, and I mean a lot of things are different. Not the main plot, storyline or world building, they did a pretty good job there. We still get most of the information, it just has been rewritten or shuffled around. For example, Percy in the books only figures out that his father is a god when he arrives at Camp Half-Blood, whether in the series, his mother Sally tells him the truth before taking him to camp. Or, in the books, Grover doesn't get Percy kicked out of school. So, quite a lot of things are different, but for the most part I feel like those changes are just different and not bad exactly. So it didn't make sense for me to do a video just enumerating those, and instead I've come to accept that this is an adaptation, and I'm going to try and understand why they made the changes that they made, and what worked and didn't work for me. When adapting mangas to animes, most of the time the anime will follow the manga almost line by line and sketch by sketch. The reason behind this is because they have similar storytelling methods. When adapting from books to live action, the job is much difficult. In the books, Percy is narrating in the first person and talks to the reader a lot, which personally I think is one of the things that make the books as successful, since it was very informal, funny and easy to read, and to connect to Percy. His narration provides a lot of the background information that we might need to know, so here, even though they still use the voiceover a little bit at the beginning, which I think was a great move, and since it's exactly the same lines of the book, it makes you immediately be like, okay, so this is Percy Jackson, and it made me very happy, but I don't depend on it very much, which again I liked, since I felt like it would be weird in this genre and it would break up the action too much. Walter Scoble still does an amazing job in letting us know what Percy is thinking, and we understand his reasoning through his acting. He really captures Percy's sarcastic side and temperament. So, in order to give the viewer all the information that we need, they ended up changing a lot of the dialogue and interactions to tell us all that we have to know. Initially, I felt like this adaptation was very similar to what they did in the Harry Potter movies. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, and I read all the books before seeing the movies. And even though there is no doubt that the books are better, and a lot of the story is left out of the movies, this was mainly because of time constraints. And in the end, I feel like the movies still transmit the magic of the Harry Potter world and are loyal to the original material and characters for the most part. So for me, it seems ridiculous that they made the choice to make a TV series, especially because it would give them more time to develop the story and then only do 8 episodes. And most of those episodes have a runtime of around 35 minutes, which again is a choice that doesn't make any sense, especially in this current age of streaming, where the 1-hour format is pretty common. And in a show with as much promoting and money spent on creating this world, you would expect them to have a budget that would allow for longer episodes. Here, the only reason I can think is that maybe they thought that the pre-teen audience wouldn't sit through longer episodes. I don't know, because I think that is also not true. So the runtime is probably the biggest problem with the show, and it led to them making a lot of changes and shuffling around, and just plain rushing through the story, really packing each episode and not letting the story breathe, if that makes sense, which obviously affected the pacing of the show, which for the most part is pretty bad. Especially at the beginning, they are trying to tell a lot of the storyline in a short period of time. The name of the episodes is a direct reference to the chapter titles of the book, that have always been known for being ridiculous and funny, especially for kids. In fact, the story in episode 2 finishes at the end of chapter 9, I'm Offered a Quest, and the book has a total of 22 chapters, which means that at the end of the second episode, we already went through 41% of the book, page-wise, page 144 of 349, which is crazy, and at that point we still have 6 more episodes to go. Obviously, most of these chapters are mostly setup, but they had to include a lot of information and almost 5 chapters of the book into each episode, so it makes sense that they had to do a lot of changes, cuts and moving around in order to tell a coherent story in that time. I expected that as we moved on to episode 3 and the main action, aka the quest, that there would be a lot less changes, as most of the episodes would only include about 2 chapters of the book. But I was quite surprised that they kept changing a lot of things. Still, quite a few of those changes weren't necessary time-wise, like for example the relationship between Sally and Gabe. But the book was written in 2005, and since Rick Riordan is actually credited for adapting the book into the script, I kind of see some of these changes sometimes at what he would have done differently if he was writing the book now. Also, personally, even though some of the changes were completely pointless, and I will get into them in a bit, I quite enjoyed a few of the changes. As I said, I reread the book, and the beginning of the book is great. It's really original and creative, and the introduction to this mythological world and Rick's way of storytelling is really fun, refreshing, and interesting. Also, the end is perfect, with some really interesting plot twists. But I found the middle of the book to be a bit repetitive. As Percy, Annabeth, and Grover leave Camp Half-Blood, most of the book is them moving towards Los Angeles and just being chased by different monsters, or stumble upon mythological places like Krusty's Waterbed Palace or the Lotus Casino, and I felt like for the most part, those moments were only there to make reference and explain these mythological stories. And that's fine, and a lot of those moments are really interesting, but some of the changes that they made in the show just made more sense plot-wise. Maybe you can justify these moments in the book by saying that demigods are just attracted to those places and monsters. But personally, I much prefer that it was Ares that sent them to the Lotus Casino to try and find Hermes. Although, personally, I didn't like that they included that storyline already in the first season. I also liked that the Krusty's Waterbed Palace was the entrance to the underworld, and, for example, that the Chimera attacked them on the train and then they went to the Arch for protection from Athena, instead of them just being in the Arch playing tourist and then being attacked there, like what happens in the book. Regarding the Arch, Rick also used this opportunity to correct a plot hole, since when he wrote the book, he made Percy fall directly into the water. But in reality, the Arch is not directly above water, so they made this arm of water come from the river and take a hold of Percy instead. Also, probably because of time constraints, and once again why, they opted for a tale instead of a show approach. So the show is just packed to the brim with exposition, which leads to really bad pacing. What this means is that a lot of the time we have the trio just talking, so the viewers can have all of the background information. And also, in a lot of the confrontations, they have them figuring out that it's a trap as soon as they walk in. For example, with Medusa and Krusty, and also in the Lotus Hotel by automatically speculating that the flowers would make you forget, which I know was a callback to the movies where they also eat the flowers, but here they were actually wrong about the flowers being what made them forget. But that was a bit too unrealistic. I mean, even if you knew that the Greek gods and myths were real, would you walk into a hotel named Lotus and automatically assume that it's a trap? Anyhow, what they did was basically just have the trio confront the monster and go on this big speech that only served to tell the viewer the mythological story of that monster, instead of them being attacked, recreating the myth, and only understanding later who the monster is and have the trio try and trick them, which has watered down a lot of the action. The exact same thing also happened in the final confrontation with Luke, and led to a very unsatisfactory finale, once again with almost no build-up and with Percy defeating Luke in a very small fight scene, which was pretty unrealistic. Not that this was a bad move every time, sometimes the writers ended up prioritizing giving more character depth to the monsters as they did with Medusa. In this instance, I really felt the influence of the rise of mythological-based books in recent years, that also prioritized the complexity of some mythological personas, like Circe by Madeline Miller and Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes. Still, by cutting the scenes, we lost a lot of the moments that made the story special, particularly the incredible dialogue between Percy and some of the monsters that characterized the books. Also, for an action show, this series has very little action. By making the characters already know the monsters, they have cut a lot of the fight scenes, and there is very little build-up, suspense, or emotional weight, and very rarely did I felt like the characters were in any real danger. Also, the now infamous cuts fading to black have been really annoying, because they cut right when things were finally getting really good, and that messes up the entire pace of the show. While having a lot of dialogue or a lot of things happening aren't exactly bad things, there is often no time to react to what just happened, as the show moves on very quickly to the next thing, without providing the characters or the audience time to process what just happened. In this regard, the fast pace is pretty faithful to the books, since they were written with the goal of retaining the attention of kids with ADHD. But in the books, Percy's perspective allows for some form of processing, which this adaptation lacks. Obviously, all of this could have been fixed by the series having a longer runtime, allowing for more moments to develop the characters, some moments of processing, and at the same time keep the interactions of the trio with monsters, some of which were almost completely cut from the show, like Karen, who takes the dead to the underworld. In addition, even though this TV show is definitely made for pre-teens, as it should be, since that is the target audience of the books and who Rick always said that he wrote the books for, I felt like they were too aware that the initial Percy Jackson generation is now in their 20s and also tried to cater to an older audience, once again with mixed results in my opinion. One of the changes that I enjoyed was the emotional tone of the show. It still has some great humor, but it also has some real emotional moments. For example, Percy's belief that there is something wrong with him is heartbreaking and really relatable. Also, the bigger focus on Sally Jackson. Virginia Cole is really good in this role, and I like more this take on her and Gabe, and I feel like they develop her relationship with Percy even better than in the book, and it really pulls on your heartstrings. The chemistry between these two actors is incredible, and the young Percy is also amazing and really looks like a mini version of Walker. So for me, this was one of the best parts of the show, which I was not expecting to be something not in the books. On the other hand, I feel like they tried to make the story more serious and lost some of the quirkiness of Percy Jackson. For example, in the books, the entrance to the underworld is described as very similar to an airport security, with metal detectors and security, and as I was rereading now, I was thinking that sounded a bit silly. But what they opted to do in the show, of just cutting that scenario and just showing a much cinematic and bleak version of the underworld, felt even more wrong to me, since it kind of changes the heart of the show and the magic of this world. To finish the changes section of the video, I want to mention the changes that were pointless in the sense that they didn't add anything to the story, just made the book fans mad, and the writers just ended up correcting them a bit later. For example, giving them 4 pearls instead of 3, like in a book, only for Grover to lose a pearl so that we can have a little bit of an emotional stake with the fact that not all of them can come back from the underworld. But those stakes only lasted a few moments, since they confront Hades a few moments later, so this change just led to a shorter build-up. Also, making them miss the deadline and having the gods start a war only to have Poseidon forfeit right away is super stupid. It undermines the powers of the gods, and it was unnecessary for the plot. It only serves to make Poseidon as this loving father, which is not exactly the case in the books, and here I'm quoting Percy when he says, "I got a feeling Poseidon really didn't know what to think of me. He didn't know whether he was happy to have me as a son or not." In a strange way, I was glad that Poseidon was so distant. If he'd tried to apologize or told me he loved me, or even smiled, it would have felt fake. Like a human dad, making some lame excuse for not being around. So this works as a great segue to another aspect of the show that didn't work for me, and here I think it might be an unpopular opinion, but I think that they failed to do justice to the gods in the show. Here I'm not saying that they did bad casting, in reality, the whole show felt incredibly well cast to me. But also in the books they just have a way of making you feel the power of the gods that I didn't feel in the Disney adaptation. Here they try to make them almost human, which I think is a big mistake. The gods are exactly that, gods. They have powers and abilities that we cannot even fathom. They have lived for millennia, and as such, we, as humans, are indifferent weak creatures, whose entire existence compares to only mere moments in their lifespan, and for the most part, their only interest in us is that we worship them. The gods' flaws and dysfunctional family dynamics were actually given a much bigger focus in the show as compared to the early Percy Jackson books, and that part I definitely didn't mind. They did a good job showcasing the messed up family dynamics. I really like Ares complaining about Athena, explaining Cronus' downfall, or the backstory of Hephaestus. What they failed to do was show us how powerful these gods are. They always kept them in their small human form, which for example with Hades made him seem a lot less powerful, and there was nothing differentiating them from humans or demigods. They also made the entire trio very frequently stand up to the gods. In the books, Percy stands out as his new kid with his smart mouth and lack of awareness. Grover and Annabeth, being a part of this world for a longer time, show a much bigger respect and fear of the gods, and only in later books, and in my opinion because of Percy's influence, do they begin to be more confrontational with the gods. I don't think it's because they lack the courage or intelligence, but for example Annabeth just knows that it's not a clever idea to openly go against and sometimes even mock the gods. The level of comfort and informality which they use in the show for me only serves to minimize the real threat that the gods are. Even though I enjoyed that they added a new myth when they included the throne scene in the amusement park, Hephaestus' part was very unnecessary and only served once more to have Annabeth stand up to a god, and appeal to his emotional side, which I felt was incredibly unrealistic. In the books, that whole trap is actually broadcasted to Olympus, perfectly showcasing how the demigods and humans are only entertainment for the gods. Overall, and focusing now more on this show as a standalone, you can feel that there was a lot of love, time and dedication put into this, which is what a lot of the new Marvel projects have been missing. Even though here, Disney has once again not fixed the runtimes and pacing problems, and has watered down some of the aspects of the show to make it more appropriate for younger kids. But still, it's very clear that this show was created for the fans of the books, and the whole show is just packed with Easter eggs. The creation and design of the world, especially Camp Half-Blood, is phenomenal, and exactly as I imagine it, with the cabins, costumes, weapons and the games, and personally I love the necklaces with the beads, and it was my dream as a kid to have Riptide. But what I felt watching the show was that the show depended too much on the book, and on this idea that people already knew the story and forgot that one of the most important parts of doing a good adaptation is for the product to stand on its own. Here, I feel like they just built on the original material and made the changes that they wanted, but always leaving the book as a foundation. The problem is that if you remove the foundation, meaning that if you are a viewer that doesn't know Percy Jackson, I suspect that the show gets a bit weaker. For example, after his confrontation with Ares, Percy just magically appears in the Empire State Building, and you don't get how he got there. And, as far as I could tell, Grover just casually says that he's 24 years old, even though he looks like he's 12. And they never explain, like in the books, that satyrs age differently, so technically Grover is a 6th grader, but if you are a new viewer, then probably that moment was just a bit weird. The photography is also very good, and brings the world to life. The CGI on most of the show is okay, except the horse part of Chiron, which leaves a lot to be desired and doesn't look proportional, and here I think that maybe the books did it better. Casting-wise, it seems that they have really nailed it, and is one of the best parts of the show. In an interview, Riordan said that it was important that he looked at it again with fresh eyes, and made sure that the show was speaking to all kids, and that everyone could look at this series and see themselves. And here he took this opportunity to once again update the original material. I also feel like they went and tried to find the actors that would do the best job in bringing these characters to life. Obviously, when you're reading a book, you always create your own image of what a character looks like, and that's different for everyone. And I don't feel like these changes are taking away any of that. They are just adding a new version of the character. Once again, they are different, but the essence and the personality of the characters is still very much the same, which I was stressed they wouldn't be able to pull off. People were already expecting Walker to be a perfect Percy, and I didn't know him before, but gods were they right. Walker seems to have been born to play this role. Percy is always very sarcastic and uses humor to deal with a lot of the traumatic situations in his life. But here we can also see the broken side of Percy, which I feel is very clear in later books, but here you get it right from the start, and that's a tribute to the acting. I think anyone is going to have a hard time, even if you're being introduced to this world for the first time, not connecting with Percy. By making Grover tell on Percy in the first episode, which as I said, didn't happen in the books, they ended up changing their relationship negatively for me. And so, even though Arian Simhadri does a good job, the character seemed a bit different to me at the beginning, and for the first few episodes he was only used for comedic relief, and fans ended up comparing what they were doing to the character to what they did with Ron in the Harry Potter movies. Happily, that changed a bit in later episodes, and even though I'm not sure how realistic that scene was, I enjoyed his conversation with Ares. But Grover has never been my favorite, so I don't think I'm the best person to judge here. Finally, to conclude our trio, we have Annabeth. I think Leah did a good job. They showed how smart Annabeth is and how she thinks fast in a crisis. She cares about Percy and Grover, and even though she can seem a bit cold at times, especially at the beginning, you can see that she's just afraid to get hurt as she did with her family, and is just trying to protect herself. I loved how she and Percy butt heads at the beginning, but then how they slowly became friends. But I think that they hinted on their future relationship too much. Also, I didn't understand the show's frequent need to separate the trio. It may have helped the individual relationships, but I feel like the relationship of the trio as a whole ended up suffering. To sum up, there's a lot of things that need correcting, but they all seem fixable, justifying the sometimes poor execution and writing of the show with the fact that it's a preteen show is a completely wrong premise. And the fact that the main audience is kids shouldn't automatically make it as something that older audiences can't also enjoy and that can't be complex and profound. Putting that aside for a moment, as I reread the book, I became aware that, at least for me, the book doesn't work as well now that I'm an adult, especially the middle section. But I think that the book series also improves as the characters got older, and still the book kept me more entertained than the TV show. Not that I think that this is an awful show. As I said, there were quite a few things that I liked, and that worked well, but it failed to keep me entertained, and as the weeks went by, I found myself not looking forward to the next episode. Also, as I said, this is an adaptation, and I'm fine with the writers making some changes, but I hope they don't stray too far from the source material and end up writing themselves into a corner in later seasons. I feel like for the most part, I'm just disappointed with how good it could have been with this cast, Rick's involvement and the proper time to develop the story. Still, it was a good try, definitely better than the movies, and it served as an opportunity for me to be once again reacquainted with this fandom, and it allows a whole new audience to be introduced to the Percy Jackson world. So if that's your case, welcome. As always, thank you so much for watching. This is only my opinion and I cannot wait to hear yours. Let me know what you thought of the show. I think I could talk about this world for ages, and there are so many little things that I just didn't have the time to put on this video that I would love to discuss with you. This is a new channel, so if you like this video, please consider subscribing. I have a long list of videos that I want to make and I cannot wait to share them with you.